This is the Keys to the Kingdom podcast, where we explore how the psychedelics renaissance becomes accessible to everyone. I'm your host, Tammy Sanders, and I'm glad you're with us. Thanks so much for listening. In this episode, Henri Sant-Cassia joins the podcast from Malta, where he operates as a co-founding partner at plant medicine-focused investment firm, The Conscious Fund. As a venture capitalist, Henri is involved in several for-profit and nonprofit plant medicine initiatives. He's a director for Magic Med, which is due for IPO in 2021. He's a co-founder of Hive, the European Center of Excellence for Clinical Trials and Novel Therapeutics. And he serves as an advisor to several psychedelic and cannabinoid companies. If you're watching video of this podcast, we ask your patience with Henri's lighting. We thought he was set up well, but his device insisted on throwing shade. Still, the dark light doesn't dim Henri's insights about psychedelics investing and bringing impactful magic to how psychedelics companies do business. Henri's keys are sound investment, market intelligence, and balanced perspective. In our conversation, he outlines the lessons psychedelics can learn from cigarettes, why recreational psychedelics aren't likely to become an investment thing, and the problem with demonizing corporate capitalism in psychedelics. Henri, thanks so much for joining me in this conversation. It's really, really great to be able to chat with you.
Thank you very much, Sammy. Very pleasure to be here.
Now, I know that I think we're on opposite sides of the world from each other. Is that the case? Are we still on opposite sides of the world from each other?
I'm in Malta, between the North African coast and Sicily, the small historical island in the Mediterranean.
Excellent. And I am in Monterey, California. It's interesting. I think you're the first person I've ever talked to in Malta. I don't think I've ever talked to anybody. I don't think I've ever known anyone who's been sitting in Malta. So before we get started, tell me one thing that's interesting about life in Malta. Like, how do you know you're in Malta when you get up and you're doing your day to day?
It's a mixture of some of the oldest things in the world. So the oldest freestanding building is in Malta. It's about 7,000 years old. And horrible construction of land, modern flats juxtaposed. It's like an open museum and also an open construction site. So if you see that juxtaposition, you're in Malta.
You know, you're in Malta. Gotcha. Right on. I also had this interesting experience with you that reminded me of this Commonwealth, the Commonwealth Club of California. They do these talks, and they recently had Sean Penn on for one of the talks. And Sean Penn was smoking through the entire talk, just cigarette after cigarette, just smoking through the entire talk. It was the first time I'd ever seen that. And you and I, when we had our first conversation, I can imagine at some point during this conversation, you're going to light up one of your cigarettes and you're going to be smoking while we're chatting.
I will almost certainly.
It's interesting because, I've been in Silicon Valley for the last 5 years. And I don't know if you ever watched the TV show Silicon Valley. I don't know if you ever saw that show. It was a hilarious TV show that was on for several years.
Not yet, but I will now that you've recommended it.
It's really great. And there's one episode where there's a woman, her name is Monica. She's in venture capital, like yourself, and she's outed and shamed for cigarette smoking. And one of my favorite lines in the show is, "This is Palo Alto. We don't enjoy all the freedoms you have in China, where people smoke all the time."
Yeah, it's a cultural thing. I think California is probably the most anti-smoking place that I've been to. In Malta, it's very common. People smoke during dinner. It's might be a Southern European thing, probably. But California, yeah, very kind of zealous cult of the body and purity. Then you have very high instances of other kind of vices in California. So it's a bit of a facade.
Well, that's exactly the point, right? That, the same character at some point during the show is lighting up this huge bong, is just engulfed in cannabis smoke, and is saying, "I can't believe you smoke cigarettes. It's just horrible," right? So it's really
Yes,
interesting, the bias around substances.
it's a huge bias. I mean, I think pound for pound, cannabis is more carcinogenic, and it it's got numerous disadvantages that are glossed over. Um, I like it. I think it's a wonderful drug, but to suggest that it's somehow superior to tobacco is quite misguided, especially if you look at the indigenous use of tobacco, and which is a kind of hallucinogenic healing drug. Yeah, very interesting kind of perception of these substances and the different kind of cultural, because in China you wouldn't be smoking marijuana if you didn't want to end up with either a lengthy sentence or a bullet. So whereas smoking is extremely common. So
Smoking cigarettes, you mean? Smoking cigarettes.
Yeah, smoking cigarettes, very common. All those kind of countries that don't have a history of negative propaganda around smoking are big boom markets for tobacco. So China is probably the biggest. The Chinese government makes the same amount of money as Apple's total valuation each year in tax just on the domestic cigarette market.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, what I'm definitely picking up, especially as I think more about and have more conversations about psychedelics and substances overall and decriminalization, that we do have these biases that are culturally context, that we see some substances as productive and some substances as predatory. I will say for myself, I have an anti-cigarette bias. I need to just come out and own that for myself. I have an anti-cigarette bias. I see negative human energy in cigarettes, because American cigarette companies have been known to behave in very predatory ways, and there's a lot of slave labor in tobacco plantations. But a friend of mine who's a former smoker told me recently that it was through inhaling cigarettes that she first learned deep breathing, and that she smoked because she had anxiety. She doesn't smoke anymore, but deep breathing became a tool for her that she learned through cigarettes and through cigarette smoking. So it's interesting, because I do wonder the kinds of lessons, what kind of lessons do currently available substances like cigarettes, what do they have to teach us about access? So, for yourself as someone who smokes cigarettes, what lessons or perspective or do's or don'ts would you apply to understanding and socializing psychedelics?
Wow. So I think you first got to look at the plant itself. So what you're smoking in the West or anywhere, if you're buying cigarettes or even tobacco, is a very different substance to what you would smoke or consume in an indigenous culture. It's been highly refined. The analogy would be the difference between, instant coffee and plucking, coffee beans from a plant. Or I think probably a better analogy is to look at the difference between processed food and organic food. There is a lot to be said for, organic, natural models. But equally, you've got to accept that to commercialize stuff and to get, your point about access, cigarettes are extremely accessible. And that's because the product has been very cleverly commercialized at scale. And now I would imagine in most places you're no more than about 50 meters from the availability of tobacco. I can, virtually every store carries it. It's relatively cheap. There's some interesting stuff there around tax. Handling cigarettes is not profitable. My family in Malta, in fact, are tobacco importers, both tobacco, cigarettes, cigars. A packet of cigarettes, you make a few euro cents. The bulk of it is all tax, and ultimately, I think that's where cannabis will go, and probably, to the extent that psychedelics are commodified, eventually much of it will be, tax that you're paying to obtain your psychedelics. So, there's some important stuff around addictive substances. You've got to be wary of it. There's some important lessons for producers in that you don't want to go down that sort of tobacco denial model.
Actually, can you say a little bit more about that? I want to make sure that I understand that and that listeners understand that as well. What do you mean by the tobacco denial model?
Well, you're a tobacco producer in the 40s and the 50s, you start to have pretty overwhelming evidence that your product is carcinogenic and habit forming. And you then expend a lot of time and energy burying that fact, only to have it come out eventually. I think a lot of people, when you talked earlier about this Californian kind of predisposition against tobacco, a lot of that is driven, as you pointed out, by the misbehavior of tobacco firms. Now, if you're producing a psychedelic compound and you have known risks, or you become aware of risks, then I think you need to learn from that and be a lot more open about those risks, because that is the only way you're going to keep consumers and regulators on side. If you start going down that slippery slope of burying or obfuscating risk, you're repeating a historical lesson that should be abundantly clear, shouldn't be followed. So cigarettes are a very good example. They are mildly, I guess, psychoactive in that you do get this sort of cognitive boost while you're on them. That's one of the reasons I smoke. Mm-hmm. If I get some awful problem at a portfolio company or an investor, starts jumping up and down, then I will automatically reach for cigarettes, because I get that slight, extra armament to deal with a problem in the same way as people use coffee or energy drinks. So there are a lot of lessons that you can learn from cigarettes. They're not, I guess, as complex in their effects as any psychedelic compound. But as I said, if you look at the raw tobacco plant and what that is capable of doing to the brain, and the way that it's used as a healing substance, which is where tobacco smoking came from. We didn't, Columbus and his fellow explorers and conquistadors didn't go to South America to find native groups going to the local store and buying packets of dried tobacco cigarettes. Yeah. They were adopting a healing practice, which then, for various reasons around transportation and then commercialization, became a cigarette that would be unrecognizable to the people that first taught Columbus and others about tobacco. So it is a powerful plant that's been probably over refined. We could talk about cigarettes for ages. I am a smoker, and
well, also, your family's in tobacco, so you actually really do have sort of a deeper, different understanding than other folks might have. And so what I kind of take it. Yeah, I
grew up around it. There were cigars everywhere, loose tobacco, packets of cigarettes. Everybody was smoking.
It's the family business. It's part of the family business.
Yeah, and it's also a cultural thing. A lot of I don't want to get off topic, but one of the things I find interesting is the idea that, and this is only an idea, that the more you worry about harm from things, the more you will, in a psychosomatic sense, bring it upon yourself. So I've always had a philosophy that I'm smoking, but it's not damaging me. And I know friends who smoke a fraction of what I do, and they cough and they're, my lungs. And I suspect that is because they've told themselves that it's damaging.
Now, you
and
know,
with a
there are
lot
people
of
now, wait, now hold on. Now, you know, there are people who would take you to the carpet for this. They would tell you, no, cigarettes are inherently dangerous. We have to pay attention to the fact that they're carcinogenic, et cetera. So they'd really challenge you on this. So I'm curious of what, I'm sure you've had this argument before. So I'm curious what your response is to this.
Well, you can point to very elderly, long-time smokers that with anything that's dangerous, there is a certain number of people that can still do it safely. There are lots of people that drink a lot that don't have a problem with it. There are lots of people that go to raves and take vast quantities of, prescribed drugs that never develop problems. So I think the flip side of the denial, the sort of tobacco company denial, is thinking that everything's going to damage you if there is a risk of damage. Logically, that's a non sequitur. Let's not use tobacco as an example, so nobody can jump at me with their statistics. Let's take a drug that has a 10% chance of causing fatalities. 30% of people will get cancer. Now that means that 60% of the people taking that drug are going to be absolutely fine, and you can't ignore that. And where you see that in action is over-regulation. You have a drug that there's an adverse reaction to, and regulators ban it. And what that does is it cuts off access to the high percentage of people that could take that drug and won't have any adverse effects. So whether you're a tobacco company covering stuff up, or a regulator, or a healthcare advocate, or a Californian kind of body as a temple eulogizer.
Except when it comes to cannabis.
Yeah, well, yes, but I mean, even, in cannabis, let's look at cannabis very briefly, because I don't consider it to be a psychedelic, but cannabis does cause problems for some people. There's no doubt about it. They either sit around doing absolutely nothing except smoking, eating junk food, and having rambling conversations that are awful to participate in, or they develop cancer because it is carcinogenic. And then you've got lots of people that don't have adverse effects. Now, do you ban it because of the people that develop cancer, or have more of an inclination towards schizophrenia? Do you allow open access and ignore the negative effects? That you've got to have some form of balance, and whether that's, saying to people, it's up to you what you do with this, but here are the facts, or whether you control it for certain people because they have got these predispositions, or whether you tax it so that there's a kind of prohibitory effects. There's all kinds of models, but I think what doesn't work is this polarization where it's either banned or everybody can have it, because both of those are gross oversimplifications.
Gotcha. This is really, really helpful. So it's helpful in thinking about psychedelics access, in that, firstly, you can see the both the benefit and the harm of regulation, and so it's something that you want to pay attention to. Secondly, companies that are involved in the production of psychedelics, you want to make sure that you maintain that integrity and honesty around your product, because ultimately the cigarette companies have shown us what the backlash will do if you don't. And thirdly, and this brings me actually to sort of the next point of conversation I want to bring up with you. Thirdly, just keeping in mind that with most substances, there's a percentage of people who will have adverse effects from substances, and there is often a larger percentage of people who won't. And so having that sort of, having a thoughtful, balanced approach to that, as opposed to an extreme ban or extreme free-for-all. And that kind of brings me to the point of decriminalization. And I'm really curious about your perspective on this, given someone who's been in this for a while. Oregon decriminalized, DC decriminalized, California has just introduced a bill to decriminalize, all around psychedelics. How do you see and experience what's happening now in the realm of psychedelics? What's your perspective on the momentum? It does seem to be growing and moving faster toward change. I'm just curious, how you're experiencing this.
Well, I mean, there is undoubted momentum. You've got to, I think, understand the layers of the different types of expanded or opened access. So a lot of decriminalization, I think, is saying.
Actually, Henri, I'm going to pause this for just one moment. I need to pause this for just one moment. Yeah, the light keeps going in and out and in and out. So let me just pause for just one moment here. All right, we realize we might just have to struggle with our light issues, but that's not gonna dim the importance of your perspective here. So go ahead, Henri.
So decriminalization is about removing the penalty for possession or use, and that's about. I think that's a sort of libertarian issue, and that's. Is it fair for a government, for example, to impose a criminal penalty on the use of a plant or then you've got another stage of that, which is, or a subsector, which is opening up access and saying, okay, well, you can open a clinic to do psilocybin therapy or dimethyltryptamine. That is a sort of regulatory framework that has less to do with criminal law and more to do with corporate and medical access to an industry and the delivery of that to patients. You've also got to differentiate between recreational use, which is beyond the remit of most actually companies or investors. The recreational market for psychedelics is tiny, and there isn't I don't think anybody's going to get particularly rich from servicing that in the same way as you could with cannabis. So
and why is it? Wait, that's really interesting. Why is that? Why do you think that, the sort of the recreational market for psychedelics, and I will say, and I've said this before on this podcast, these are not substances that I personally do recreationally. I don't find them enjoyable enough to do them recreational, even though I find them profound and powerful for development and expansion and healing. But I am curious why the perspective that you don't see, at least from the vantage point of a venture capitalist, you don't necessarily see there being a notable market for recreational psychedelics. I'm curious about that.
Well, look, first of all, if you look at the numbers, you'll see that the illegal market for psychedelics is much smaller than cannabis. The key reason for that is they're very strong drugs.
Gotcha.
Now, you can smoke a joint on a weekday at work and your lunch break. Right?
No, but no one would ever do that, though. I mean, come on.
Now, you try taking, a hefty dose of ibogaine or toad venom or,
You're not going back to work. I'm going to tell you that right now.
And they frighten people. These are strong, mild things have a bigger audience.
Gotcha. So milder substances have a larger audience, and psychedelics are not. I mean, they can be. You can microdose them, and I think maybe if there is any sort of a recreational market, it would, I think, maybe coincide with the microdosing movement. But do you think
it's similar? But remember, microdosing is a sub-threshold dose, so you're not aware of it. So it would be a bit like wafting a glass of wine at yourself from a distance and having an enjoyable drink. In order to take something recreationally, you've got to have a noticeable impact, I think, and microdosing is outside of that. Microdosing is trying to use an imperceptible dose for medical purposes.
Gotcha. So microdosing would be too little, and if you are trying to take psychedelics recreationally, it's likely that you're going to end up taking a dose that may get you to a place where you can't still sort of function the way you normally would, even if you're taking sort of a dose for recreation. So it seems like it's just harder to engage psychedelics recreationally, at
Yeah,
least maybe for
it's
some people
more
it
of
just would be
a
harder.
it's more of a risk.
Yeah.
Not just a risk, but it's a heavy duty thing to do recreationally, whereas cannabis is mild and you can, there's very strong cannabis, don't get me wrong, but it's, that they are at different levels in terms of intensity. So the recreational market is small. It's also not where you're going to make money. Are you going to produce a bag of mushrooms retailing for $20, make your $10? Or are you going to make a drug that retails for hundreds of dollars, where even more, or thousands? You look at, there are some drugs that cost tens of thousands. Are you going to, give somebody a recreational product, or are you going to put them in a clinic and charge $10,000 or $15,000 to treat their alcoholism, their treatment-resistant depression, their PTSD? If you're an investor or a company, you're going to go where the money, the margin, and the market is. And some estimates of the size of the psychedelic rec market puts it at about 1% of the cannabis market. They're very, very different. To give you an alcohol analogy, I guess it's the difference between the beer market or the wine market and the market for absinthe. Much smaller, much more. How many people do you know that regularly drink absinthe? Not many.
I think a lot of people listening to this are going to have to Google what absinthe is. So your point is well made.
The drink that used to be made from wormwood. It used to claim to have hallucinogenic properties. It's usually very strong. It's usually 70%, alcohol by volume. It's a bit like overproof rum, and I realize that in America you use a very different way of measuring alcohol strength, but you're talking about stuff that's nearly twice as strong as the average whiskey or bourbon or vodka. Now that's a limited market. You don't, go for a couple of lunchtime drinks with your boss and have a couple of shots of overproof rum, but you might have a beer, a glass of wine, a cocktail. And that, I think, is the difference inherently between strong psychedelic compounds and other typical recreational substances, whether that's caffeine or alcohol or cannabis,
or nicotine.
Very, very different. Yeah, nicotine.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so what I'm hearing, to sum that up, what I'm hearing then is it's a couple of different kinds of market, or a recreational market and a pharmaceutical market. And what we're likely to see, at least from your vantage point, what we're likely to see with psychedelics is more of a pharmaceutical market.
Oh, yeah.
Not the least of which because it just can generally be challenging to reliably take psychedelics recreationally.
Let me qualify that, make it a bit more precise in that, first of all, we're talking about a healthcare market. So there are plenty of models that aren't pharmaceuticals, so clinics, which may use pharmaceuticals, but they may equally use plants, retreat centers, addiction programs, telemedicine. There's lots of stuff I think you should look at it as broadly psychedelic medicine. That's how we describe it as a fund. We are the conscious fund, and we deal with psychedelic medicine to distinguish it from psychedelics more broadly and recreational use. And the second distinction is that it's not just that the market for recreational is smaller or it's a more difficult market. You've got to go where the money is. Now with cannabis, you've got this giant market. There's some medicine in there. There's a lot of recreational use. There's some cosmetic use. There's, supplements. That's a huge market. You can attack it, and they're always going to be. Now, in psychedelics, the rec market is very small. The medical applications are vast. and the
Okay.
medical pricing, the margins in medicine are much higher. So it pays you to say, forget the rec market, we are doing treatments for X, Y, and Z, and that is where you're going to make money, and return money to your investors.
Gotcha. Okay. This is really helpful. Just understanding the focus of psychedelic capitalism, and why there's that focus. Not only because it is helpful to have that healthcare focus, but also there's an expectation that's where the money is going to be in the psychedelics market. And to that, I mean, this really brings us to the main topic, is whether money and money making can be mindful and conscious in psychedelics, and to what the answers, ramifications are for psychedelics being more broadly accessible. Now, I know that there are numerous VC funds now and myriad companies vying for commercial entry into the realm of psychedelics. How does the Conscious Fund decide what companies to bring into your portfolio? What defines the Conscious Fund as one of the most active VC funds in the category? Why are you all sort of unique and uniquely positioned?
That's going to be a long answer.
Well, we could take some
No,
time, but I want to get to other stuff too. So
I'll be as quick as possible. So why are we so active? What's our unique thing? We've been in this from the sort of the pre-Big Bang kind of dark ages of psychedelics, when there wasn't really a landscape and it was a leap of faith. So we're very, very well established and have been from the earliest days.
Can I interject a question? Why make that leap of faith? What brought you in the fund to psychedelics in the first place?
My partner Richard and I knew it was coming, and if you're going to make a leap of faith, it's best done when it's a true leap of faith. It doesn't have the same meaning, resonance, or benefits if you take to give you an example, there's absolutely no point now thinking, oh, Bitcoin's big, let me buy in, or Google's a good idea, why don't I put some the time to do that was kind of 20 years ago.
It already happened.
Yeah, it's already happened. So you have to, the earlier you go, and that applies to our model as a fund. We are early stage investors, so we're looking to find stuff before everybody else and take the risk that our prediction of that success is accurate, and we go in as early as possible, because that's when you're able to pick up assets cheapest, because you're taking a risk. Nobody knows about it and you're backing something. And so we went in very early. We've tried to get to know everybody, whether they're advocates, companies, regulators, other investors, media people, patient advocacy groups. We've tried to position ourselves at the very heart. We're also very active in terms of, we're not just putting money out, we're helping companies to grow, to scale, to make contact with people, to get their messaging right, their branding, their operating models, their access to public markets, other investors, the whole. We are fanatics about this, and the fund's operating stance reflects that. There are other funds, we work with them. They've all got different styles. Some are more numbers driven, some are passive, others are new. Each one is unique, and our uniqueness, I think, comes from the fact that we live and breathe this. We also create ecosystems. So we own part of Microdose, the media company. We helped to set up the Psychedelic Medicines Association. We have drug discovery companies that we've set up. We have investments in companies that do things like AI, or have libraries of compounds. And the idea of that is that you plug your portfolio into itself so that it becomes stronger. I'll briefly touch on how you vet these opportunities, and then I think the most interesting thing you've raised is how you invest responsibly and sustainably, and whether that is possible, or whether we're all Wolf of Wall Street sociopaths that are money driven.
Well, I mean, there's also some ground in between there, and I have a couple of questions. I have a couple of questions about that, but tell me how you decide which companies to bring into your portfolio. Let's do that one first, and then we'll go to.
So that's a mixture of classic venture capital. So, is the team strong? Do you like their personalities? Have they got experience? Have they made exits previously? What is the operating model of the company? What do the financials look like? Are they raising enough money? Is the brand good, or does it look as though it's been made with, Microsoft clip art from 1985? Or, what are their future plans? Are they going to be able to raise enough money to bring the drug to market? Can they open clinics if they're buying them and not leasing them? So you've got all this kind of a mixture of business common sense and known venture capital metrics for assessing something. Then you've frequently got very heavy science and patent law that has to be examined. So if it's a drug discovery company, is the science solid? Are their patents solid? Do they understand how to bring a drug to market? Have they operated clinical trials? Is their advisory board knowledgeable enough to do that? So there's a whole medico-legal vocabulary that has to be explored. And then you've got specific psychedelics. That does it make sense from a psychedelics perspective? Are they producing a drug that's 1 million times stronger than LSD and administering it to 89-year-old patients? Probably not a good idea. Have they selected the right
I was hoping that's where you were going to go with that, because I was like, is that a good idea? That doesn't seem like it's a good idea.
It's not.
Okay.
Or is it too mild? Are they, oh yes, we're going to use a very, very small dose, and we're tackling veterans with, overwhelming PTSD, and we're basically going to tickle them with a psychedelic feather. Probably isn't going to work. Is the compound appropriate? Are you using a compound that generates empathy for a situation where you want a disassociative effect? Is there methodology around that compound viable? Are they extracting it in the right way? Are they making the right analog? Do they have the right medicinal chemistry experience? So there's certain psychedelic things, and there's also softer, which I think is going to be a nice segue into your questions, which is, are they doing it appropriately, sustainably? Are they plugged into the psychedelic world? For example, very simple question.
Actually, wait. Before you do that, before you do your example, I want to sit on that phrasing, that word of softer. I generally struggle with this word. I have spent a long time in learning and development, and I hear people talk about soft skills all the time. And whenever people talk about that, I just start to shake my head. I was like, there's nothing soft about these skills. Usually this is the stuff that is hardest to get right. So I think what I hear you saying, when people talk about soft skills, I challenge them to actually think of these as behavioral skills. When you are talking about sort of the soft aspects of investment, what I hear you saying are the social impact aspects of
no, not necessarily. It's much broader than that.
Yeah, so I want to get at that. Like what? Like let's not.
I'm going to rebut your rebuttal. So
fantastic. But let's not use the shorthand of soft. Let's actually call it what it really is.
Well, all right. Well, let's look at this from a very brutal perspective. It's quite possible to make money in the psychedelics market with completely unsustainable, wrong companies. Right? You can do that by playing stocks. You can do that by day trading on an even more short-term basis. You can illegally set up a pump and dump scheme on public markets. You can put money in early and whip it out before retail investors go piling into a company. And you can do it purely on what you might call, let's not use soft and hard, brutal financial terms. There are lots of brutal operations that have made money for certain types of people. But that is quite a narrow investment viewpoint. That is looking at, you can look at a company that's about to go public and purely on the buzz, the numbers, the volume of stock traded, what the pricing is. You don't have to really look at what the company's doing. You can make some short-term money out of that. Right now, so let's call that the sharpest practice that you can have.
Okay.
Now you've got a slightly broader approach, and you say, well, okay, why don't we do that? But we'll also look at how successful the company might be long term. And that might lead you to a greater profit because you're not so short-termist. It's not so, and then you've got this even broader approach, which isn't, you could argue over the terms hard and soft. And it's not just about sustainability. Let me give you some examples.
Okay.
Company might come to us and say, we are raising money. Come and have a look. So we have a look at it. And then everything checks out. We think, okay, let's ask them some more difficult questions overtly, and let's do some covert checks. So overtly, we might say, okay, Tammy, how long have you been in psychedelics? Oh, we set this up a month ago. Red flag. All right, everything checks out, but you're not vested in the market. You weren't doing this in your bedroom or your PhD lab 5 years ago when it wasn't fashionable. You may have jumped bandwagon. We might bring somebody that that we know, and we might say, well, tell us about Tammy, and they might say, oh, she's really good to work with, or she steals the communal milk out of the university fridge, and now
trust her. You can't trust her with your lunch in the kitchen.
No,
you can't. Yeah.
Now we've got something that isn't hard financial or business orientated, but it's an indicator of a potential problem, or as my partner Richard says, patterns of behavior, or whatever you want to describe it as. And these are beyond what you might consider to be the type of stuff that you'd learn in an investing class, but it's common sense, and some of that is driven by the industry. And more broadly, let's look at the tale of two companies that are not psychedelics, so this isn't kind of controversial. Company A makes coffee, and it makes instant coffee, and it does it with a very chemically intense process. And when they buy their coffee, they're complete bastards, and they screw the producers down in price. Now they are able to make a fortune for a while. Okay, they're buying cheap, they're producing this coffee that's sold cheap, massive volumes, everything's going great, everybody loves it, and then one day somebody watches a documentary that exposes poor business practices. Everybody talks about it on the internet. Game over. Okay, they've made a short. Now company B has a fair trade agreement. They produce nicer coffee. They struggle more at first, but a far-sighted investor will say that company will probably be around in 30 years. Let's back it. Now that's a broader view of sustainability and ethics, and it's not the case that always works.
Yeah, gotcha. But I get what you're saying, and I think actually what's interesting then is the same way that I use behavioral in place of soft when I'm talking about the skills of individuals. I think we can also use behavioral in place of soft when we're talking about the behavior of companies. So I think that's what I hear you saying.
Except, and this unfortunately, my father uses the expression, you cannot be a Boy Scout. He was a surgeon, in fact. You've got to also look at the flip side of that, and that is that it's quite possible to behave scandalously and get away with it. If you look at some of the big corporate scandals, whether that's greenwashing, poor ethical practices, lots of big companies have had scandals survived and grown. Look at Facebook, look at some of the practices that you see Google and other big tech companies accused of. It's not having much of a material impact on their user bases or their profitability.
Oh yeah, so, we know that companies can get away with a lot more things than individuals can, for sure.
Yes. For sure. So these behaviors, there is a kind of third phase of that. So you've got, you know, real bastards, and they're using slave labor, and everybody's made to work at gunpoint, and they're ripping people. That's bad behavior that you can get away with in the short term. In this market, I think that would be a pump and dump scheme, right? It's outright illegal, might get away with it, but probably not. Then you've got a more ethical company, which a long-term investor might prefer to back, but then sadly, you've also got a hybrid where they know what they can get away with and they're pushing boundaries, and they will probably do maybe the best. Do you back that company? Do you? So it isn't a case that you will always do better by backing the good people, because human nature is bad. There is a tendency for people to ignore bad behavior. You know, look at Dubai now. Dubai is a huge tourist destination. The British government is now investigating the imprisonment of the ruler's daughter. Has it impacted tourism? Probably not, because people push that aside and they see beaches and shopping and luxury retail. That behavior isn't so important. You see that pattern time and time again with commerce. So when we look at this issue of sustainability, environment, ethics, indigenous cultures, all these other stuff, you've also got to be a little bit kind of realpolitik about it and say, well, you've also got to take a balanced view of these things, and you don't necessarily want to back Boy Scouts because nice guys often finish last.
Yeah, but you also don't want to back, you know, outright bad actors as well,
and
because you've
got to back good behavior, because consumers are sophisticated. We're actually at the fund working on now what we're calling the 10 Commandments of psychedelic investment, which is about the marriage of ethics and good practices with money making. And in that document, we talk about you've got to have a balanced view. You've got to recognize, for example, that consumers and patients are not going to back companies that they feel have breached, you know, ethics or have done bad things. You look at how, you know, the kind of Twitterati of forcing people out of jobs and companies to change their stances. And there's also a large group of consumers that will now only buy stuff if it's ethically produced, or if they've got the right. So all of this is a kind of balancing act. Generally, you want to back good people, but you've also got to back people that are effective. And when you look at the psychedelic medicine revolution, it's only going to happen if companies do effective things, as in get large patient groups to start using these therapies. If you've got somebody that's too idealistic, that they haven't got the killer instinct required to battle regulators, pharmaceutical companies, entrenched conservatism, all these barriers, you're going to end up with a very tiny revolution in a teacup. So this is really about backing people with a killer instinct that will run through walls, but that will do their best to do stuff properly, but not cut their own throats in so doing. That, I think, is the sweet spot for investors. So to the question of what do you look for to bring a company into your portfolio, it sounds like you're looking for companies and founders, you know, sort of operators of those companies to understand that they need the business acumen to be successful. They need the behavioral skills as a company to be ethical, work with integrity, and be sustainable.
And then they also there's this grit and perseverance they're going to need to have, because they're going to need to push through barriers. So I hear all three of those.
Yeah, I mean, and there are fourth, more numerical things. You know, have they got the money to do it?
Mm-hmm.
Have they set things up right? Is it structured right? Is it, that's the kind of unseen foundations that can trip up less experienced investors. You back a drug discovery company and they run out of money halfway through a clinical trial. Goodbye your investment. You know, you didn't spot that number, or it's structured in such a way that suddenly, you know, things fall apart, but they've made a tax error, or, you know, there is, in addition to these behavioral things, there are numerical,
there's the business,
mathematical,
there's
no, I mean beyond the business. Some of this is pure maths. It's not, business is operating fine, but there's a ratio that's wrong, or the cap table of the company is wrong, or there's all that as well. I mean, it's not easy to pick these companies, scale them, and exit. That's one thing that's the reason that funds exist. It's not, you know, there's over 100 companies in this sector. Now, how do you differentiate them? How do you get in at the right point? How do you get out at the wrong point? That's unbelievably complex, and that's why funds exist, is to take that heavy lifting away from investors so that they can just put their money to work.
Gotcha. Okay. So I don't know what to call the other aspect of that, because I mean, when I say business, I mean not just the operations of the organization, but also the funding and investment, sort of the money side. I'm talking about sort of the full money side of the organization, and then behavior.
Yeah, I guess we call it financial and legal, I suppose.
There you go. Okay. So
you've got behavioral, financial, legal, you've got business.
Okay.
And then you've got this sort of broader behavioral kind of sustainability ethics. Is it, are consumers going to like it? And one final thing is, and this is weird, one of the key properties of psychedelics is they give you this kind of hyperperspicacity, and you're able to sense the slightest little thing on them. And I suspect that if you are treating patients, and although it sounds like I'm some kind of new age lunatic, if there's something wrong in how you're delivering that treatment, whether it's you've got a boardroom policy that doesn't favor females or minorities, or you've ripped somebody off at the supply stage, or you've cut corners, I think that subtly patients, particularly as the number of patients rise, people will sense that, and they will just think, this treatment is a little bit wrong here. Yeah. And the other side of that is that these patients tend to be super sensitive. If you've got a mental health condition, you're ultra, you know, the doctor looked at me the wrong way, or didn't like his moustache, or she was wearing the wrong perfume, or that was a really uncomfortable chair and I felt closed in the clinic. Now amplify that 1,000 times with a psychedelic compound, and everything has got to be absolutely right. If you get that right, you will perform near miracles. If you've got something out of joint, the patient is where you're going to feel it most.
So it's almost like you have to, you know, for businesses who really want to be successful in psychedelics, there's a sort of extrasensory perception, this sort of higher level of intelligence that you will want to inject in how you function as a company and how you do business.
Yeah, you're creating a near magical experience. If you've ever seen the film Casino with Robert De Niro, there's a scene where he's going through the catering of the casino and he gets very annoyed that one muffin has got more blueberries than the other. It's that little, it's the kind of attention to detail that you would have in luxury tourism. And there are people coming into the industry from that sector. I know a couple. you're creating this wonderful, magical, spiritual, deep healing experience, and the details matter. What, you know, and you can see that in patient outcome figures. If I give you a compound and you're in a, you know, a car park somewhere and it's raining, and I give it to you and I shove it down your throat and I say, you've got 10 minutes, get better. Outcome, probably bad.
Yeah.
Now I fly you to Barbados and you're in this lovely villa and there's no noise and I'm playing the violin and somebody's massaging your feet and there's a therapist. What do you think is going to be? So the aim of the industry has to make the experience as uplifting as possible. That's one of the keys to it, and give people the space and the environment to overcome their own problems. This is
wait, but hold on a second though, Henri. Don't you end up sort of like to some degree then causing some access issues, because, you know, not everyone can afford to fly to Barbados and have music played for them, and you know what I mean? Like if that's the level at which companies have to perform, then, you know, where's the psychedelic healing for the rest of us?
No, that is, you're right to point that out, that you are equating luxury to magic. That you can go to most small towns, villages, third world countries, developing countries, first, wherever you go in the world, there'll be a lovely cafe where you can, they're not necessarily expensive, but they've got it right, or a hairdresser where everybody's very chatty and positive, and you could do this at a microscopic scale and get it right. You can bake cupcakes as well as any department store that's charging, you know, $20 a cupcake. You can get a great cup of coffee. Where you don't see that is where people have gone the over-processed route, or it's too mass market and it's generic and it's soulless and it's, you know, that it's about getting things right, creating the right atmosphere, not cutting corners, and above all, it's about the patient's experience. As long as you prioritize the patient's experience, you'll eventually get there. If you start thinking, okay, we can make another $7, but the chairs are going to be really hard, and we've got to get the patient out of there 7 minutes quicker, and yeah, Tammy's got to just fudge the safety figures, quickly brush over them, you know, and then we're going to make, the reality is patient's experience is going to suffer. I don't think you've got to do stuff expensively, but you've got to put the time and attention in to get that.
So you've got to
whether you're making a drug, or you've got an addiction program, or you've got an app, you know, has it been put together in 10 minutes, or did you test it 20,000 times?
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, gotcha. So what I'm hearing is the work of psychedelics is about ensuring that you've infused the experience with care, attention, and integrity. You can't, if you don't do that, it's quite likely that there just will be, and again, you know, I agree with you, like, not to sound too hippy dippy about this, but there will be a vibration that people might pick up on.
You know, if you go for any number of softer treatments, go for a massage, how do you want it delivered? Do you want somebody pummeling you in a hurry, or do you want somebody asking you, are you sitting properly at work? Have you had an injury? Is this
you don't want to feel like you're on an assembly line, right? Like
exactly.
You know, exactly. Yeah, I gotcha.
And the same goes this. The same goes for this.
Yeah, you don't want this to feel in any way like an assembly line. Now, you mentioned this actually earlier. You talked about the Conscious Fund creating the 10 Commandments, which I think, you know, it sounds like it might be something similar to the North Star Pledge, right? Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the North Star Pledge, and I can imagine there's some. Yeah, I can imagine there's some differences. And we'll put a link to the North Star Pledge in the show resources for folks who want to explore that further. But I don't want to talk about that too much, because I want to focus on what the Conscious Fund is doing. You know, one of the sort of the critiques that we hear is the scaling up of psychedelics is what's causing concern, right? On the one hand, there's the notion that if we're serious about psychedelics being more broadly available as a tool for human healing and development and expansion, we need capital to drive innovation, to expand availability, to ensure access to reliable, high quality product. On the other hand, there's the notion that capitalism inevitably injects inequity into the ecosystem. Corporations are privileged with favorable laws and regulations. They reap outside benefits and rewards, and the average person is stuck, grappling with decriminalization. The first part of this I want to ask you about is the scale part, and then we'll come to the social impact part. I'm interested, how the Conscious Fund thinks about scale. It seems critical to making psychedelics more broadly accessible, but it also has this potential to cause harm if these noble ends are used to justify problematic means. So, I think, so you've mentioned the 10 Commandments. I think there might be something in that in terms of like how you all think about scale, but what would you say? How do you think about it?
Well, there's different types of scale. Look at airlines, for example. Look, most airlines have to be run at scale. It's just very difficult to do anything else, particularly with sort of mass air travel. Now, some airlines have developed operating. Everyone says, "Oh, I love flying with that." Isn't it? They do it at scale, but they retain the human element. And others, I won't name them for legal reasons, obviously.
Yeah, we won't name them, but there is that one that considered charging to have people go to the bathroom. I'm not going to name that airline, but yes. But you're right. This is actually a really good analogy. As I've done a lot of flying, and there are some flights that I have taken where I feel like, wow, this they care about whether or not I'm comfortable, and then the others are like, just get on the plane so we can get it off the ground.
Yes. So scale, it is. It's just not a reflection of reality to say that scale is necessarily bad or capitalism is necessarily bad. People that talk about capitalism being bad, there's a counter argument that more people have been lifted out of poverty by the capitalist model than ever have been in human history. So that you can't, these polarizing approaches are not helpful. Look, as everybody knows, particularly the ancient indigenous cultures that came up with or discovered psychedelics, this is about balance. There's, you scale, but responsibly. You scale with a patient-centric model. You don't take it to excess. Equally, you don't keep psychedelics in a minority by refusing to scale, because then you're denying patients access. Why do you scale? Because there are a lot of patients that require a more structured way to get the benefits. There are lots of people in the psychedelic industry who have the broad-mindedness, intelligence, and willingness to do research and handle compounds responsibly to self-medicate. Right? They can find a compound, dose it, take it, give themselves therapy, and come out of it. Those people are in a minority. The average person, it's a strong drug. You've got to present it in a safe form at the right dose. You can't have, Joe Public sitting in their apartment with a set of digital scales and
trying to figure it out,
and then the kids are crying and they slip and they give themselves 50 times the dose, but it's not going to work. Give them a tablet that's been safety checked, that's been through a clinical trial. Or now, what the other thing to look at. So I think there are some very compelling arguments for creating medicines, and unfortunately, it isn't true to say everything is favourable for corporations. And I can illustrate that very simple, the fallacy of that. If it was that easy for corporations to make money, investors all over the world would be ridiculously wealthy. They just put their money.
But aren't you all ridiculously wealthy? I mean, come on,
no,
aren't you?
Because most investors lose money. Because
Mm.
most companies go bankrupt. Most ventures fail. They are inherently risky. What the good companies do is they manage those risks and they adapt. And the problem that you get is companies over adapt.
Mm.
Look at Facebook. Facebook was an unbelievably risky proposition early. So was Google. There was no guarantee that Google or Amazon or Apple, Apple has had numerous dicey situations in its past where there were bigger companies, IBM, much bigger. There were lots of companies, the desktop computer, the DOS operating system, Windows. There was no guarantee they were going to. Well, the problem that you get is they almost get too good at it, just like pharmaceutical companies, and then it shifts completely. And now that company that had to take all those risks and that's an abusive market position.
Yeah, it comes across as a behemoth. I mean, I think Amazon is a great example of that, right? Like, I remember one of the dumbest things I ever said was, I don't understand why you'd ever invest in Amazon. I mean, they're not even profitable. They haven't been profitable since they started. That's just ridiculous. That was a really dumb thing I said. But what did I know, right? Like, what I had always seen is that a company is profitable and then it's on the stock market, and Amazon completely defied that for more than a decade. And then things changed. And now
and it's
it
the
is.
same with it's a giant. And the same with a lot of these psychedelic companies. The majority are going to be loss making. You cannot develop a drug profitably during the time when it's not on sale. So if you take a standard clinical trial path or whatever that comes to, 7-8 years, you're not making money. Guaranteed, you're tipping investors' money into a bottomless pit in the hope that you get a phase 3 approval and the drug gets on sale. Now, for people that say investors and capitalists have it all their own way, try producing a drug, because most clinical trials fail. There's a safety problem. It's not efficacious enough. Something goes wrong. And you lose all those tens, hundreds of millions of dollars that you've invested. Drug development is inherently very risky. Operating a clinic is very risky. You've bought or leased a property, you've staffed it with very expensive therapists and nurses, and you've done all your advertising, and people don't turn up quickly enough and you go bankrupt. You're in a risky field, and what is required for mainstream growth is responsible capitalism. So you try and encourage good practice. You don't cut corners. Patient safety is a priority. Patient experience is a priority. You work with regulators. You don't, there are all sorts of, there's no magic formula. It's just like, use a kind of humanitarian analogy. There's no magic formula for building a family or a marriage or a partnership. You can't.
Well, especially a successful or functional one.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
But there are things you avoid. You don't cut off your partner's head. You don't, put your children to work at the age of 4. You do send children to school. You do have dialogue.
Avoid lying and cheating. That
exactly.
I mean, I didn't even know you were gonna like the where you just went to. I was like, yeah, that you definitely don't want to do those things.
That's true.
But you also might want to avoid lying, cheating, obfuscating, those kinds of things. I mean, it's interesting. The Compass Pathways, and I'm an investor in Compass Pathways. It opens its doors in 2015 as a nonprofit, then it switches to being a for-profit 2 years later, and all the suspicion arises over the company's means and motives. And some people caution about jumping to conclusion with Compass Pathways, but it's interesting because I hear you saying that switched from a nonprofit to a for-profit actually puts the company there's risk. There are risks that are greater now for the company now that it's a for-profit. There's risks for all the investors, all of us who are investors in Compass Pathways, that are greater now that it's a for-profit. So what I hear you saying is you can't sort of set aside the amount of risk that it takes for a for-profit company to actually be successful.
Yes, and look at the pharmaceutical companies that have tried to tackle a lot of the conditions being tackled by psychedelic companies. And why has that resulted in failure? Well, the problem is that every time they tried to do it, trials went wrong, drugs didn't work, and they spent an awful lot of money with probably very good intentions, and that they wanted to produce an effective drug, and it just didn't pan out, even with all the intrinsic advantages of having a giant corporation with vast experience of clinical trials, regulatory approvals, medicinal chemistry, marketing, putting teams together, laboratories. Still went wrong. It still went wrong.
Yeah, this is a really good point, that the Johnson and Johnsons and Pfizers and Mercks and others of the world have actually not come out with psychedelic compounds. Henri, is there the expectation that all these smaller companies will do this work, like do this good work, and then sell to these larger pharmaceutical companies? And would that be a bad thing, a good thing, both, neither? What do you think?
So the reality is that the majority of the smaller companies will go bankrupt, full stop. So there will be the people that are still standing have got a number of options. You've got what is arguably the Compass model, where you raise enough money to bring a drug to market and to sell it. You've got another model where you get the drug to, say, phase 3, and you bring in a marketing partner, because it's one thing creating a drug, it's another thing selling it globally. That's another immensely expensive exercise. You've got other models, as you've pointed out, where they will exit to bigger players, because you can discover a drug and you can get it to a certain phase of trials, but it gets increasingly expensive. And often companies will say, well, to get this to a large patient population, we've had to exit at a certain point, because these bigger entities are the only people that can deliver at scale. It's no joke, selling a drug, just in the US is phenomenally expensive. Now take that drug and try and sell it globally. 180 different medical regulators, export, import requirements, labeling, stock control, safety protocols. You need billions and billions and billions of dollars to do that successfully on a global scale. If you are a $50 million Canadian entity, how on earth are you going to do that? You can't. So, there will be these exits. I don't think it's a bad thing that big pharma will be involved. I think that it is evolving, it's learning lessons. And it's not about demonizing big pharma, it's about how do you get the drug to patients. And you can see that on the clinic and the other kind of delivery side. You will want eventually to have these therapies available in lots of hospital groups that may have had scandals, but the benefit is that more patients get them. So it's all a balance, You can demonize these companies, but you can also recognize that they're doing a good service. Compass has had its detractors, whether that's around its approach to IP, its switch from a non-profit, it's everything. But if that company gets a viable remedy into the hands of lots of people, you've got to balance it. And you can apply that analogy to families, marriages, relationships. There are lots of marriages where there was infidelity, but it turned into 30 years of bliss. There's families that were dysfunctional, kids that are feral and awful, that turn out to be wonderful people and win the Nobel Peace Prize. Or that what is most damaging to this whole industry is polarization. If you want a profit is awful, that's polarization. If you are a sociopathic, investor and you only care about profit, that's awful. If you demonize companies and you don't see the balance here, it's awful. If you think that regulation is terrible, what happens when ibogaine that has a cardiac risk is sold on street corners? Awful. Equally, if you prohibit these drugs, it's awful. All these awful things happen as a direct consequence of polarization.
Yeah. The tendency toward the extreme positions.
Yes.
I'm presuming that's part of what the 10 commandments for the conscious fund is addressing, that you all are wanting to ensure balance in in terms of how your portfolio companies operate.
Yeah, there's two objectives. One is to kind of present what we think are some of the important things that investors should understand about the right way to do psychedelics. And the second is a little bit more detailed, and that is, we have been contacted by several larger players and larger entities, from the UN to very big family offices to very big ethical investors, that want to do something a lot more precise. So, for example, if you're going to have a sustainable clinic model that marries the requirement to have it capitalized and to have higher payers almost subsidizing more universal access, what does that actually look like? I.e., it's all very well and good saying, access should be for everyone. Well, all right, work it out. What do the numbers look like? What does the operating model look like in detail? How much capitalization is required? It's going beyond standing on a soapbox and calling for good things, and actually
getting down in the details.
That in a meaningful. So we've done this to stimulate a much more detailed debate that we'll be having with these various groups.
Okay. All right.
Because nobody's done it yet. It doesn't exist. There isn't a sustainable, detailed clinic model. There isn't a viable set of ethical policies. There isn't a viable model for IP. Doesn't exist yet, I don't think. If it does, please email it to me and I will save the next 3 months. But this stuff has to be developed. And that means people with money and people with opinions and people with intelligence have all got to work together. If one of those groups does it on their own, you will end up with a biased, polarized model. If people just say, yep, access for everyone, it's worthless. How do you deliver it? If people just say, here's $10 million, I want to give access to everyone, and it's a gift, also arguably worthless, because that money will run out. And somebody doing it on a very intelligent basis that doesn't have the money or the reach that an advocate might, is going to be coming up with a solution in darkness that never gets uptake. So there needs to be this, collaborative is an overused term, but to develop those models, you have to have a collaborative model.
You talked about, the people with opinions, the people with intelligence, and the people with money. Thinking about the people with money, that kind of brings me to SPACs. When you and I first connected in January, I don't believe there was a link on the homepage of the Consciousness Fund to the Conscious Acquisition Company. I don't think that actually existed yet, and we weren't really talking about that. And so, just very quickly for folks who don't know what a SPAC is, this is an acronym for Special Purpose Acquisition Company. As its name suggests, a SPAC is focused on buying other companies. And part of how a SPAC can raise money to buy other companies is it IPOs, and it looks to the public market for capital to make acquisitions. What this means is when an investor puts money into a SPAC, they may not yet know exactly what the SPAC is going to own or how sound the acquired companies will be as businesses. And there's recently been this explosion in SPACs raising money. I read a New York Times article recently that showed in January 2020, less than $1 billion was raised for SPACs. And 1 year later, in January 2021, almost $26 billion was raised in a single month for SPACs. There's also been a lot of star power associated with SPACs. Earlier this year, Jay-Z sold his cannabis company to a multi-million-dollar cannabis SPAC. Colin Kaepernick is lending his social justice cred to a multi-million-dollar SPAC with social impact mission as its focus. So, from my perspective as an investor, SPACs do involve some degree of speculation because we may or may not be betting on proven companies. I'm really, really curious to know how you see this being beneficial for psychedelics and access to psychedelics. And then a second part to that is, and what do we need to be mindful of or watch out for? So just want to have you just kind of
Sure.
lend your expertise to these two questions. How is this beneficial and what do we need to pay attention to?
There are the first, let's look at the benefits to the CEO of a company that's a really dedicated scientist that needs to raise a lot of money to scale and would hate to take his company public directly and access all that public markets capital. What a SPAC will do is it will take that company, it will take another couple of similar companies and give that CEO the benefits of being public in terms of access to capital, publicity, without the time and hassle required to set that up as an IPO or an RTO directly. So he carries on running his company. There is a manager of the SPAC at public markets, CEO of the SPAC, but the individual companies within that SPAC are able to leverage all the public market benefits without the hassle of doing it for themselves. The benefit to the market generally is there will be vehicles that can capitalize probably later stage companies. Remember how expensive this stuff is. Drug development, even media companies. If you've got a media company that wants to reach a global audience, can you do it with your $500,000 friends and family round, or do you actually need tens of millions of dollars to scale? And the third kind of broad benefit is some of these, or certainly our SPACs, will be thematic. So if you've got 3 software companies, one deals with onboarding, one deals with patient management, and the third one deals with patient data. If those are rolled into a SPAC, you will start to get proper synergies, economies of scale. They start to kind of feed off each other properly within your SPAC. It's like, this is a ridiculous analogy, but it's like a big, well-capitalized magic bubble that encapsulates these companies and lets them float to higher heights, basically.
So that they're actually stronger together than they would be on their own.
Yeah. And some of that is access to capital, some of that is synergies between the operations, some of that is the publicity that goes with publicly listed companies, visibility. They are, I think, going to play a good part in the industry. They are also a way of early stage investors getting liquidity. So you've backed a company earlier, SPAC sweeps it up, you're able to kind of exit and haven't got, a really long hold period. They have got benefits. They will need to be, done properly, as with all things. There has been an explosion of SPACs. They won't all be good. So, and you're trusting the managers of the SPAC, the exchange, the various checks and balances and people to raise the right amount of money to invest into and bring together the right assets. And then crucially, and this is very similar to our fund or venture funds, scale those companies. The acquisition is not the end of it. What the SPAC must then do is increase revenues, increase efficiencies, tackle new markets. They're a multiplier. They're not, they're not this sort of deus ex machina that comes in at the end. Oh, we got acquired by SPAC, and everybody lives happily ever after.
So you're saying the SPAC acquisition is actually the beginning, not the end.
Yeah, it's the beginning of a new, bigger phase for those companies involved. It's a means to, you might be acquired by a SPAC that's going to help you market your drug because they've got $1 billion to do drug marketing, or they might be amalgamating big data sets between different. The SPAC will have a sort of theme or purpose, or certainly the ones that we're looking to do. And we've been developing it now for months, probably close to 6 months, and it will be announced, we hope, in the next few weeks, because they do take a long time to put together.
Gotcha. So it sounds like, as an investor, the way that I think about this is the degree to which I trust essentially the folks who are managing the SPAC. Do I trust that you are operating in a way that has my investor interest at heart? And do I trust that you understand and have what it takes to actually scale the business that you've acquired?
Yes, in much the same way as you're putting money into a fund or you're backing in individual companies, you're really backing people. Okay. Do they know what they're doing?
Yeah, essentially, exactly. All right. Okay, this is going to be interesting to see how this unfolds. I will want to know, how do I keep up on SPAC news from the Conscious Fund? There, again, there are a lot of SPACs out there, but this is the one that has me most interested. So I will want to know how I keep up on it.
We'll keep you posted, definitely. And hopefully you'll come into the fund at some point, so you'll see this kind of from the inside out.
Yeah, be very interesting. All right, Henri, we've got to, now at this point, you've gone totally dark, so we got to let you go. Your phone is dying, and you've given us so much of your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I imagine you've had this kind of conversation more than once. So I think one last thing I'm curious about, from your vantage point, what are the advocates and the doubters in the psychedelic space? The advocates and the doubters of capitalism and psychedelic capitalism in the psychedelic space, what are we not curious enough about or aware of that we should be paying attention to when it comes to psychedelic capitalism? And we'll give you the last word here on that.
So the advocates, I think, have got to be aware of short-termist thinking and hype bubbles and all manner of non-long-term things. This isn't a short-term opportunity to make money. It's a long-term way to transform healthcare. And the doubters have got to understand just how much capital is going into this industry, how many big institutions are already involved, how legitimate it already is, and how much validation there's been from top universities, governments, regulators. This is not a flash in the pan, either for advocates or doubters. This is a revolution that's very established now and only continue to get bigger.
Fantastic. Henri, thanks again so much.
Pleasure.
I look forward to talking with you, and until next time.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the lighting, but I'm a venture capitalist and not a cinematographer. But yeah, great pleasure speaking, and hope to speak to you again very soon.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
That wraps up another episode of Keys to the Kingdom. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the show notes for resources we discussed, and follow the Keys conversation on Twitter at Psychedelics Key. Until we meet again, remember, you are connected, you are love, and the kingdom is yours.